So, what is trauma? Trauma this, trauma that, but what exactly is it? Is trauma that one time mom and dad shouted at you? Is trauma just something that magically disappears the very next day? Or is trauma wishing you had a serious physical or mental health issue so that people will validate your pain and take you seriously? Is it wanting to tell someone your entire life story under one rushed breath? Or is it feeling like everyone's out there to get you and that you're all on your own, feeding into that hyper-independence? Is trauma self-sabotage, worsening working memory, dysregulated nervous system, and intrusive memories? Yes. Trauma can be all of the above and even more. From acute trauma stemming from instances like mom and dad shouting to chronic trauma, which is the exposure to domestic violence, to complex trauma, which is the exposure to multiple traumatic events. Trauma is your body reliving that stress even after that stressful situation has passed. And let's not forget, this is just the reality of an average person who has access to basic healthcare, housing, and education. Just for a minute, think about the people living in susceptible environments, right? People who are more likely to be in environments of drug abuse and mobs and triads and gangs and human and sex trafficking. Just for a minute, think about the people who are living under military siege, occupation, and genocide. With that being said, each and every person's trauma looks different, and each one of them matters. Speaking of mom and dad shouting, it definitely serves as my alarm clock when I'm sleeping past 11 a.m., if not my constant source of negative reinforcement that gets me all bunched up in nerves to never let my South Asian parents down. And to all my Asians in the room, you know exactly what I mean. I remember there was even this running joke about how they would take this dangerous trek to get to school, right? Through raging rivers and treacherous jungles, encountering snakes and tigers along the way. Well, yeah, navigating Hong Kong for their very first time was a whole lot worse. Following in my granddad's footsteps, who worked as a journalist in Hong Kong, my parents moved from India to Hong Kong, settled here, had my sister and I, and embraced their new life of fast-paced living, towering skyscrapers, and a culture of modernity. Something that was non-existent in their coastal town of southern India, where wearing a crop top might get you the same reaction as murdering someone. But that's the thing, this is the reality of being a South Asian Hong Konger, right? It's the fact that countless generations before us have had to leave behind the homes where they, their parents, grandparents, and their great-grandparents, and their forefathers in order to embark on this new journey in a new country without knowing its languages, systems, or culture. To give you some context, the number of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong increased by 37% in the past 10 years. And they make up 3.8% of the entire population. This is a huge and notable quote-unquote South Asian exodus that is continuing to grow till today due to the burgeoning markets, increasing demands, and abundant opportunities that usually comes at the cost of shedding one's true essence of culture. With that being said, you can imagine how my parents were grappling onto cultural norms while, learning to be parents along the way. And I guess you could say it is a difficult task, right, for countless South Asian immigrants to raise their children while starting afresh. So they were constantly in fear of stepping out of line, of systemic barriers, language barriers, systemic racism, but they were mostly in fear of losing touch with their religion, which is the core that governed our entire beings. Being South Asian in Hong Kong entails a heightened sense of responsibility, where you see yourself consistently having to represent your race when navigating the city streets. Almost as if you're the ambassador for your country. And don't get me wrong, I'd love to think of myself as Mr. India, but truth be told, a single error on my part can reflect badly on the entire community. This is how it becomes easy for us to be labeled with, negative stereotypes like, oh, this person's a drug dealer, this person's a violent individual, just based on the color of our skin. I might have to come to terms with the fact that I might be rejected for housing by landlords. I might be racially profiled and ID'd by the police. I might lose touch with my collectivistic culture because you lose that sense of community and identity. With that being said, you can imagine how overwhelming it was for my parents. So the fact that they were able to navigate all of that while, maintaining our lives here in Hong Kong, maintaining their parents' lives in India, it's an incredible thing. And for that, I'm incredibly proud of them for it. But of course, with the good comes the bad and the ugly. You can imagine how this constant stress and this pent-up anger would have inevitably led to anger outbursts. And for my parents, they would lash out on me, their primary target. And it reminds me of a quote that I remember once reading about how the eldest child grows with their parents while the youngest child gets raised by them. And truer words have never been said about us being the child. Mistakes were made along the way, constant arguments and family problems corrupted our everyday lives, and it was in those moments of intense physical and emotional violence that I internalized so much of that fear as a child. I cried unexpectedly, I had temper tantrums, I would even go from my soft, bubbly self to throwing a table at a classmate. I had dark, depressive thoughts, and I was always, always, always scared of anything and everything. But that's the thing, as a young child, I guess you could say like a third parent mediating these family problems, I looked to my peers and wondered, why are their problems so different from mine? Why are their parent-child dynamics so different from mine? And that's when I realized, children of trauma, despite how broken our families might be, we are so much more mature, far beyond our years. We learn to pick up these shards of glass and assemble them time and time again, because all we ached for was a sense of security, peace, and stability. So you might be wondering, Yusuf, where exactly is the neuroscience in all of this? Well, if you're an evolutionary biologist, you would know that this constant state of fight or flight would have actually helped me in prehistoric times, right? Where it was useful to be extremely sensitive to your environment. But if you're a neuroscientist, you would know that the amygdala, which is a part of your brain that controls fear, was constantly pumping cortisol, which is a hormone that keeps you alert. And this was happening constantly, right? Like even when I was at home, a place where you're supposed to feel the most at ease. And in terms of the neurocircuitry of trauma, the medial prefrontal cortex, so that's the image you can see there, the medial prefrontal cortex is suppressed in patients with trauma. And because of this, it fails to inhibit the overactivity of the amygdala. So basically what that means is that the amygdala is pumping way too much cortisol. It's chaotic, it's just crazy. It's a disaster. And because of this, patients with trauma respond to this trauma-related threat to a disproportionate level. At the same time, there could also be an opposing effect, right? An opposing effect of emotional numbness. And again, this depends on the person that you are because we all have individual differences, right? All patients different. There could be emotional numbness where there's an overactivated medial prefrontal cortex. So when it's overactivated, it over-inhibits the amygdala. So when there's over-inhibition of amygdala, then there's very little to no cortisol being produced in your body. And that leads to emotional numbness. So now you can see this constant state of fight or flight makes your body prioritize the defense against these external stimuli instead of the growth and nurturing of it. This constant state of hypervigilance weakens your immune system for fighting off things like infections, inflammation, which then causes other health conditions. Think of it this way. How can you grow and nurture a tree if someone is constantly trying to cut it down? Your first response is to stop the person from cutting it down, right? Not to continue watering the tree. That's exactly what trauma does to your body. When there's a traumatic instance or circumstance, your body is responding to this external stress instead of aiding its own growth. And that's why healing from trauma can take years and years of therapy, breath work, and other psychological treatments just to get your nervous system back on track. Now let's get deeper into the biology of it. A trauma-informed brain can alter the way that your DNA is being transcripted. A trauma-informed brain can change typical structures and functions of your brain, such as causing the shrinkage of your hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory. And this is how a trauma-informed brain can cause behavioral changes and how it coincides with other mental health illnesses, such as depression and anxiety. But let's not forget that this is not unique to just racially marginalized communities in Hong Kong. Intergenerational trauma has left its mark on societies across the globe, from the Great Famine in India to survivors of the Palestinian Intifadas. Trauma has been transferred from one generation to the next. So understanding, like recognizing the universality of this phenomenon can help us in understanding the depth of its impact on our lives. Now, if you were to think about the neurobiological consequences of trauma, they are just as profound. Studies have shown distinct differences between the brains of those who have a history of trauma compared to those without. And these differences manifest as higher susceptibility to mental health illnesses, dysregulated nervous system that then leads to physical health issues, and the need for long-term healing. So, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is 2 times more likely in patients with trauma compared to those without. For depression, it's 4 times more. And for suicidality, it's 12 times more. Let those statistics sink in for a moment. When it comes to the state of trauma studies in Hong Kong, they're extremely limited. Most of the focus has been on the PTSD of American soldiers who came back from the Vietnam War, which is to say the scope is a bit limited and pretty Eurocentric. Limited attention has been given to ethnically diverse communities of Hong Kong, because things like domestic violence and trauma-induced events, they pose unique challenges to the police and social workers to deal with because they lack the specialized knowledge in doing so. And this even reminds me of how, at school we were taught, call 999 when you're in danger, when you need help and stuff like that. But what do you do if even the police can't help you, right? And I've met far too many people who downplay the severity of trauma by using it synonymously with stress. With trauma, there's a nature and there's a nurture aspect to this, right? In terms of the nurture aspect, the environment of picking up your parents' stressors can greatly influence your own. And when we come to the nature aspect, remember earlier I talked about how trauma changes the way that your DNA is being transcripted? Well, yes, that's a good example of what we call epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of the changes in neural activity without alterations to the DNA sequence. So in simple terms, there's basically a lot of changes. The cells creating your proteins become disrupted. That creates irregular protein chains, yada, yada, yada. So yeah. And a really good example to illustrate epigenetics is the study done on Holocaust survivors. What they found in this study is what they've shown us to be compelling evidence that extreme environmental consequences can shape genetic expression in subsequent generations. What they found is that the survivors from this Holocaust, they expressed suppressed hunger genes, which then affected their children and their children and their children's children. So basically what that means is that after they're released from, extreme starvation from these concentration camps, they could not stop the amount of food that they were eating, and they could not feel satiated. And that's the thing, astonishingly, this spread to their offspring, their children. And that's the thing, talking about the interplay of environmental factors and genetic factors is crucial when we have conversations on trauma. Now let's bring these conversations closer to home. Equipping healthcare professionals, social workers, educators, and other stakeholders in this kind of contextual knowledge through widespread community-based programs will promote healing and resilience. Practices like somatic awareness, where you pay attention to your body and regulate your breath and pay awareness to your body, is also just as useful. Things like anxiety relieving practices like meditation, yoga, breath work, these are all good practices to have. But then you might be wondering, Yusuf, I can't just breathe my trauma away, right? And that's the thing, you're right. It does do good to, keep your body and mind in check, but ultimately there needs to be systemic change. There needs to be systemic change in how we address intergenerational trauma as a mental and physical health issue in the medical, in the social, and in the law enforcement sector. Ladies and gentlemen, let us strive for a future where kids don't have to fixate on the wounds of their past. And yes, even though I might just be a 22-year-old Gen Z kid who's working in the field of neuroscience, I hope I'm not leaving you with a message like this meme that my friend sent me. Instead, I hope you've learned a bit of the neuroscience side of trauma. And I do want to leave you with a quote that has helped me personally through my own trauma responses and moments of intense fear. Scared is what you're feeling, brave is what you're doing. So regardless of the fear that you're facing, you've already taken that big leap, and that's incredibly brave. And now I can officially say, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.